Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to start in just a few seconds' time. Looks like we've just got a couple more people on the logging in process, so bear with us for a few seconds and we'll be with you shortly. Okay, so welcome everybody to one of our many seminars here to help inspire and support our clients with their recruitment needs. Think Skill Set was inspired from our recent marketing campaign, which looked at how candidates sell themselves, their skills, and how clients can ensure they are recruiting for the right skills. I'm Graham Lucas, the Managing Director for the Northern region at Michael Page. I've been with the business for 14 years. I consider myself incredibly fortunate to work for a business that's involved every day with supporting people in making career moves, which without doubt is one of the most important things that we can do. I'm proud to say that I work with a team that will help 30,000 people change their lives this year. And with Jon's help, he'll introduce in a second. Hopefully, we're going to take that over the 30,000 mark today and add a couple more to it. Pleased to welcome our guest speaker on that note, Jon Lees, who has worked with us on the Think Skill Set campaign and contributed to our learnings derived from the research we conducted. But more about that shortly. Hi, Jon.
Good morning.
So Jon is a career coach, writer and speaker, previously the Metro's resident careers expert. Jon is one of the UK's best-known career transition specialists and career writers. He's the author of How to Get a Job You Love and director of his own career coaching business. Jon regularly speaks at conferences and consults businesses to support their teams' career and recruitment needs. Quick outline of the agenda today. The webinar should last around 45 minutes and we'll take you through the following bits. We're going to have a very brief look on the research that we conducted and the findings from that. Producing a clear shopping list of skills required. Problems and how candidates present skills information, better ways to retrieving skills evidence, and finally finish with a Q&A. So please do get involved. Send your questions through the chat box that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. For now, I'll pass you over to Jon.
Well, good morning, everyone. In an age where candidates are applying for a wide range of jobs, it can be very difficult for them to focus on the skills that they're going to need for a new role, and most importantly, setting themselves in the right way. The research undertaken recently by Michael Page shows clearly that not everyone is confident talking about their skills. 45% of people did not know what skills to talk about during a job interview. And with that level of confusion in clients, it can be equally tricky for employers to check for these skills at the interview stage and to ensure that the job description is being met. The transferable skills that people have matter. They're key to any recruitment process. They determine how well new hires are going to interact with others, the level of influence that they'll hold when dealing with internal and external stakeholders, and their ability to overcome a range of challenges. There are countless soft skills that an individual may possess. Some of these are quite difficult to assess. Confidence is an important issue as well, and the research that we undertook showed that a significant number of people were, although they were relatively confident to talk about the skills that they were required, that this wasn't always evident when it came to interview. They weren't also at all sure about what hard and soft skills employers were looking for. So the research seems to indicate that people are relatively aware of their skills, but not very good at matching them to the needs of organizations. There is a publication, a white paper produced recently by Page Group, which looks at assessing candidates' skills. And that's during the interview process. This white paper is very useful. It talks about a range of things, including how to structure an interview, effective questioning using the STAR model, comprehensive assessments using a balanced scorecard approach, how to assess candidates' hard and soft skills, and testing candidates effectively. Some of these topics we're going to be covering in some detail today, The report also gives away some very useful industry-specific interview tips. The full report and this slide deck that we're using today will be available for download after the webinar, as will a recording of everything that we talk about today. And now Graham's going to tell you a little bit about the skill checker tool.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the skill checker tool can be found on our website. It's fairly recently been developed, but in response to feedback we received. So it allows candidates to assess the skills that they'll need to progress within a role or profession. Candidates can search by job title to find out the skills and qualifications their employers are actually looking for in that area when hiring new staff. And of course, from a client's perspective, they can view the skills that they should be looking for when writing a job description or conducting an interview.
So moving forward, we're going to think today about what assessing skills is all about from an organizational perspective. Before we get into this, may I also remind you that we're happy to field questions during the webinar, and you should be able to type them into the software, and we may be able to take more than a few of them towards the end of the session. The big question in our minds today should be about how we predict workplace performance and impact. We all know what a good interview looks like, but of course, the best benchmark for a recruitment interview is understanding how that is actually going to play out in terms of workplace performance. Another way of describing that is to tell the difference between the candidates who are good at talking the talk and those who can walk the walk. So organizations can put together shopping lists, if you like, in various ways. And this is a very simplified version, but it's one that points to the heart of the recruitment process by looking at some of the key aspects that you will find in top performance. We're either going to be looking for potential in more junior roles, or we're looking for active experience and evidence of that experience. And we'll say a little bit more about that as the webinar continues today. Motivation and attitude come alongside skills. How we use the skills is important as the skill itself. A lot of organizations at the moment are also looking for the ability to pick things up very quickly when we talk about a fast learning curve or a rapid learning curve. That's a fairly positive characteristic. And it's a common factor amongst organizations that they're trying to find staff that can pick the job up, work quickly, and have a positive working style to get on well with colleagues. And the other elements there are ones that you'll be familiar with. We're looking at underpinning knowledge and thinking about ways of looking at the performance we need from new hires within the first 3 to 6 months and the long-term potential that we might want to identify in future talent. Let's think about some of the problems that organizations typically experience when they're trying to gather skills evidence. Candidates demonstrate a number of behaviors. They talk about jobs that they've done in the past or the kind of job that they think they should be interviewing for. And they're not always very good at describing their own skill set. When they do, they fall back on cliches. You'll have heard candidates say at interview that they are a self-starter or a team player or highly motivated. The problem with cliches is that they really don't give you any useful information about what somebody can actually do in the job. The next thing they do is to confuse skills with personal quality. So they might talk about being resilient, for example, which is a great personal quality, but doesn't necessarily point you to the things that people can do. Exercising skills under pressure is one of the things that we are looking for as part of the hiring process. In CVs and in job interviews, a lot of candidates make a lot of claims, which are not always supported by evidence. So a good interviewer knows that you get behind the claims and you ask important questions like, where exactly did you do that? And finally, if you've got talented candidates that you're looking at, thinking about the way that they package skills is important. Encouraging interview candidates to talk to you in terms of motivated narratives. Stories work in order they help candidates to move forward in the process, but they also help you as an interviewer as well, because you can start to really understand the context. So I'm just wondering at this point, Graham, where this takes you really in terms of your
Yeah, John, I think actually there's a couple of interesting points in there. I think you've referenced the fact that interviewer are looking for people to be able to demonstrate a skill under pressure, which I suppose an interview can often be. But you've also talked about a good interviewer being able to kind of bring some of that stuff to the surface at a time where unemployment's relatively low and lots of organisations are struggling to hire into certain roles. Where does the responsibility sit for bringing this to the surface? Is that with the interviewer, or more of the job of a candidate going through the process?
I'm sure you won't be surprised if I say it's a bit of both, but where candidates have thought carefully about the skills required for the role, that shows that they've done above average levels of research. So they're starting to package their evidence. That would be my view, I think, Graham. But I do actually think that organisations have a duty of care, if you like, with candidates to ask great questions which bring out skill sets rather than expecting people to come sort of oven ready with everything in the right language. I don't know. Would you agree with that as a seasoned interviewer?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think it would certainly be disappointing if a candidate wasn't prepared, but I think your second point is really valid, which I think sometimes interviewers can fall into the trap of almost expecting people to know that bit more than is reasonable. And I think great interviewers do have that open mind and ask those slightly better geared questions that really allow somebody to shine, for sure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So on screen at the moment, you can see an extension really of the material about what goes wrong with candidates. Dull stories, what I mean by that really is stories that are quite hard to listen to. And again, you could say that's partly about candidate preparation. As a career coach, I always encourage my clients to go forward with energized and interesting stories that don't go on too long as well. But any skilled interviewer can do this as well by drilling down and to ask about real situations, to get around some of the generalized material that's coming forward and to say, well, just tell me about that process. What actually happened? Wrong language, that's where, again, this cuts to the heart of Graham's question there about who does this work in advance. Because where a candidate is essentially presenting their material in a language that you do not understand as an organization, they probably haven't done much homework. But we also have to sympathize with the fact that there are today thousands of job sectors and different kinds of roles, and new kinds of roles are being invented all the time. So it's slightly unreasonable to expect external candidates to tune in immediately. So I think what a good interviewer does there is often to do some translating, to say, well, this is what we're looking for. And the words that you use should tune the candidate in to evidence from their own experience. And the last point there is a good reminder that an awful lot of candidates will say, we did this, as a team, we did this. Now, modesty is a great thing, and it's quite a good personal characteristic, but it is the interviewer's job to get behind that, to ask the question, well, what did you add personally to the team? What wouldn't have happened if you hadn't turned up that day? What was your specific and distinctive role in that team? We're starting to think a little bit about what makes candidates stand out and how do we securely identify top performers? How do we predict workplace performance, not just get overwhelmed and impressed by interviewer performance? There's a really big difference here. And again, I've been working with recruiters and interviewers for a long time, and it's always good to see those practitioners who can understand that some candidates are just really, really good at job interviews, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be great on the job. So we have to look at other ways of getting candidates to prepare, to think about the kind of evidence that they should offer. And so, some of that can be done in the hiring process. Some of it can be done in the way the job description is put together. Some of it can be done in terms of encouraging candidates during an interview process to think about the skills that are demonstrated by top performers in the roles that they're applying for. It certainly is a problem, though. The research we've undertaken does indicate that a lot of candidates feel at sea here, that they're not really sure what they should be talking about. But I'm going to turn that around the other way and say that it is always the interviewer's job to ask some great probing questions. One of the areas where candidates can be relatively passive is in their transferable skills, because they essentially believe that they're putting their work history and their work experience in front of a seasoned interviewer and hoping that their skills transfer. It's quite interesting when I talk to job hunters and candidates, even at the executive level, well, they often essentially say, well, those are my skills, that's what I've done. It's up to the new employer to understand how they transfer. Well, I have to disagree, because I think in a busy marketplace, we need to translate. If job candidates need to translate, and organizations need to ask them to do that. But translation isn't just about describing terms in language that makes sense. Certainly, we want candidates to avoid jargon. We do want to hear language from the context, and we can prompt that by asking questions which describe the role content in some detail, and then say, where does your experience fit in against that? But ultimately, I believe that skills only become transferable when candidates describe them in language which organizations can get excited about. They actually need to convey those with energy, sell them if you like. Graham, I'd love to know what your view is on transferable skills and how much work candidates generally do to get them across.
Yeah, I think the very, very best candidates are automatically switched on to that, and I think they do great research on both the organisation and role they're applying for. I think, ultimately there are some incredibly other capable people who might not be as natural when it comes to interview, and I think to your earlier point, John, we'll just need pointing a bit more in the direction. And I think businesses that work that bit harder at providing a bit more context prior to an interview, maybe simple things like very up-to-date job descriptions and well-written advertisements, I think can certainly help signpost other people to be able to do the same.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, and perhaps just creating a culture where candidates understand that the language of almost every different organization is very specific, and encouraging them during the interview to really think about the context, to think about where their skills will fit in, and to use evidence from their past. And that takes me on to the next point, really, which is about some of the negative indicators which are around candidate behaviors in an interview. So what we often find is that candidates give vague evidence. Now, they can do this for a couple of reasons. They can do this because they really don't have strong evidence to offer. And they can do it because they don't really understand what the employer is looking for. And we've said earlier that the Page Group's research helpfully points out the sort of the gap between what employers are looking for and what candidates understand. But the third reason is sometimes they just don't know how to communicate them. And so they come up with generalized statements about what they usually do or what they would do in the future. They use a phrase like, I think it's important to, or what we did. And that's back to the team contribution. So generalization can be a sign of an underprepared candidate, but it can also be the sign of lack of concrete evidence. It's quite important that candidates are not given too much time to offer vague generalizations, because most of the material that they put forward in this context is not going to help you very much. So what will help? How do you seek positive indicators? Well, you're going to use great questions like this. We know that competence-based questions often begin, tell me about a time when you, and that's fine. But What works even better is if you can encourage the candidate to talk about events that are no longer than half a day. So talk about a time when a project was started, when a project was completed, when they had to manage a difficult meeting or motivate an underperforming team. The smaller the time frame, the better the skills evidence. Because if we're talking about the way we did a job over 3 or 4 months, we will always generalize. But if we talk about what we did in a specific meeting with the aid of a skilled questionnaire, we will say specifically what we did and the actions that we took and the decisions that we made. And when you're discovering how people make decisions and exercise skills under pressure, you're starting to get at high quality evidence. So do ask for examples. Ask for more than one example. The first example that the candidate will give you may be the highly prepared and polished one. It's good to get one behind that as well, which is a little bit more raw and therefore more likely to reveal difficulties that the candidate experienced. It's not a problem to discover that candidates get things wrong, or they make mistakes, or they do things in ways that when they reflect, they would like to improve upon, because that often demonstrates the ability to learn from experience. But do probe, ask those really good questions. What did you do? What did you say? What was the outcome? So help candidates to focus on specific events and narrow the time frame. Moving on then from specific past events and actions, we want to know what the candidate's contribution was. So drill down, think about the context, be really clear in your own mind. Now, I'm afraid that one of the things that candidates often do is they paint too extensive a picture in terms of context. They may even start to tell you about the organizational structure and the history of the job and so on. So a bit of guided focused questioning to say, tell me about that specific event. Tell me about the day you started that project. That sometimes is very helpful. What we're aiming for is a detailed picture of what the candidate thought, said, and did as the situation unfolded. In my experience, nothing will give you a better picture of somebody's skill set than the way they reflect upon a critical incident, a key moment. It could be a high point, it could be even a low point in their career. It could be the day that they rescued a situation, or covered for somebody at short notice, or delighted a customer. It's all related to what you're looking for, of course, but it's good to be imaginative as an interviewer to get people to start to give you very, very specific evidence. Now, in the white paper that I talked about earlier on, we've got a great model there, which you may have come across before, which is about using the STAR model to encourage candidates to structure their information. So beginning with the situation, the context, you might look at the task, what the candidate actually had to do. The action is how the candidate responded and delivered. And the last bit is the outcome. And it's great to pin people down to say, well, what was the outcome in concrete terms? But I'd like to recommend that with more experienced candidates, it's a good idea to just play with a couple of other extra elements. STAR plus, you might describe it as. What did you learn from the experience? And what would you do differently next time? Because the strongest candidates seem to have processed that experience, and they could even talk about times when they really did make an error or things went wrong, and can reflect on that. Graham, I'm just curious to bring you in here to see from your own experience as well, whether most of the people you talk to do tend to do that, reflect on what they did and how they would do it differently next time.
I think your point is valid, which is the people who often will do that are more experienced people. I think they'll naturally narrate that, but I think it's a great technique generally for interviewing. I think the more you can get somebody talking about those two extra points, I think the more, to your point, John, you're getting some real insight into their level of self-awareness, their level of reflection, and all of those things for me have a huge importance when you're looking at things like agility and transferable skills and people's ability to adapt. So I think it's a really good point.
And do people tend, sorry to come back to you on this, Graham, but do
No.
people tend to give you a clear sense of what the context is? In this model, we've got situation. That's the kind of context setting. Do you get that as well from the candidates that you're interviewing?
I think the biggest challenge we come up against is candidates start at too high a level. And I think you've referenced that in the previous slide. So I witnessed one of the best interviewers that I've seen interview. I sat alongside a procurement director who was talking to somebody who worked in procurement. They were interviewing, and they started off with how they'd saved a business £2 million, and actually what that great interviewer managed to do was almost before they expanded through STAR was to almost drill back down to what one incident during that whole project, as amazing as the 2 million was, what one incident, was the key turning point and was the point where you being on that project made a material difference to its outcome and almost set the context for that situation and then work their way through the STAR. So I think people will try to do it, but often in my experience, they try and do that at too high a level.
Very interesting. Yes, it's almost as if we're looking for that tipping point. A colleague of mine used to describe these as critical incidents. So, we have a career that goes on for many years, but those careers are dotted with these critical incidents where we did something which really made a difference or turned the situation around. One of the techniques that I recommend interviewers to think about is it's been described as a funnel technique, which just is a good reminder that every part of the interview where you are looking at key skills, where you're looking at things that really matter to the organization and to the role, that you're reminding yourself that there is a narrowing focus here. And you start with a relatively low order question, which might be about, might be something like, tell me about a time when you've led a team. But then you're going to listen hard to the evidence. So that somebody's giving you relatively positive information about working in a team and everything running smoothly and everyone getting along with each other, then of course you can reframe the question. And the supplementary question will be, well, tell me about a time when that team wasn't working so well, or it had to deal with conflicting deadlines, or it was under time pressure, or maybe where key members of the team were absent. So you're starting to change the terms of the question. And as the funnel narrows, the probing becomes more exacting. Now that can sound really painful, but actually if you're listening really carefully to the evidence and the answers that the candidate is presenting, you're doing something which is quite affirming, because weaker interviewers tend to have a kind of a script in their mind and don't demonstrate very well that they're listening. I think Graham's agreeing with me there. And it's good, isn't it, Graham, to really listen to what the candidates say and then to probe those words that, as they're being used.
Yeah, I think for me, John, this is probably the key slide that personally I'd kind of really love to labour for people, and I say it having seen some really skilled interviewers, and I think often the mistake we make because we're diligently preparing for an interview is we prepare as you can only prepare those first questions. You can't really prepare the secondary and tertiary. You can give them some thought, but until you've got the answer, it's very difficult to do that. But I think what people often do is put too much importance on the response to the first question. And actually, to your point, the first question is a conversation starter. And I think if you do that in the right way as a skilled interviewer, it doesn't come across as being kind of painful. I think it comes across as being, genuinely engaged and interested to understand the mechanics behind that outcome, typically that people are talking to you about. But I think that's the point that I would labour. That this technique is a massively underrated one. I think whilst people are aware of it, I think people just don't go far enough. So it's a really good slide.
When I debrief candidates who've been to job interviews, they sometimes say that it wasn't a great experience because the interviewer didn't seem to understand the role very well. And that may well be about the interviewer's lack of ability to communicate the essentials and to set the context. And although often the experience is very, very positive, sometimes candidates also say, well, I really didn't feel I was being listened to. So I would thoroughly agree with you there, Graham. It's kind of going away from your script pitching in a couple of great questions and then actually probing the answers that are given, even repeating some of the words that the candidate has said to you in the interview, not only helps you move forward and drill down, but it also really shows the candidate that you are listening very, very carefully. And that's also why I recommend a short summary at the end of a funnel process. This takes 2 or 3 minutes, by the way. The summary says, what I'm hearing from you is this, and because that helps to clarify in your own mind as a recruiter, have I got everything I need on this topic? Do I need to ask another great question? But it's very, very affirming for candidates to feel that their evidence has not been pitched into a vacuum, but the interviewer has processed them and understood them. Even if you're not going to offer the candidate the job, you can offer them a great job experience, a job interview experience. And this is one of the ways of doing it. So other ways of gathering evidence. And by the way, if you've got any questions for us, do feel free to type them in. We're going to have a chance later on to answer any questions that you have about assessing candidate skills. This is another way of refining the process, really. So we're used to a question like, what have you done? Tell me about a time when, but this is going more to Graham's point about going for critical events. Where have you made a difference? Now, we often think that this kind of material only really works well with hard skills or technical skills. And of course, it doesn't. It's just that soft skills need a lot more preparation to think about. How is your success measured? And that's the point, really. It's very easy to say, well, I saved time, or I saved money, or I made money, or I hit my target, or the project was completed on time and on schedule. But if you are talking about your soft skills, candidates should be encouraged to think about better ways of communicating them. And I would also say interviewers should be encouraged to find better ways of drawing them out, because you're looking for evidence of where candidates have influenced, where they've won hearts and minds, where they have changed relationships. So, for example, dealing with an angry customer and turning a situation around. You're also looking for examples of times where they have encouraged others, either in team contexts or through coaching or mentoring. So I think it's a bit of a get out clause, and I do hear it quite a lot, that people say, well, it's easy to talk about hard skills, but soft skills there's much more guesswork involved, and it's all about personality. I don't believe it is. I think it's equally important to draw out lots of evidence there to ask yourself, how do I know that this candidate can really do the job? Because the thing about soft skills is you think you're measuring them in the interview. If somebody appears to be easy to talk to and a great communicator and is clearly capable of influencing a situation, how do you know that they are actually going to exercise those skills in the workplace? And that's one of the reasons for the last point there, is that stories really help. Stories rather than generalizations. I've already made the point, but the additional point I want to make about stories is that it's much easier to get a real picture of how a candidate operates, because it's like having a recording or a slice of that experience. And if they're not giving you enough information, you ask for more information, you ask for more detail. Teach them to tell a story and to ask for, really constructive evidence. And here's some questions that draw out what I would call motivated skills. And I think these are vital to today's workplace, because yes, we like people to have skills, but we want people to have motivated skills. In other words, skills that they're pretty good at and they enjoy using. The kind of skills that they look forward to using when they're packing their work bag on a Sunday night, or when they get up and begin their commute on a Monday morning. So ask them that. Ask them about the activities that have energized them. A great question, I think, is, of all the jobs you've ever done, which one have you enjoyed most? Which projects have given you a buzz? Look for that energy, because that energy is a fairly clear indicator about candidates who are going to be motivated to give you extra performance, to go the extra mile, to add things for colleagues and clients, customers, and keep asking these great questions. What exactly were you doing? What was the outcome? What did it feel like? the what did it feel like question does tend to move candidates away from a kind of a bland summary of their skills to imagining or reimagining, remembering what they think the situation actually felt like. So thinking about, I mean, Graham, again, I'm going to ask you to come in here. Just love to know your own experience about how do you spot the candidates who are really going to be energized in work? What do you see in them?
Yeah, I think where your point's really interesting, John, and I think ultimately if you're interviewing somebody for a job, they're often looking to leave a job that they're maybe not as highly engaged in as they would like to be. That might be a generalization. And clearly, you know, I think most candidates now are switched on that the right thing going into an interview to not do is maybe to maybe be critical or be negative about the organization or the role that you're in. I think people have hopefully kind of moved beyond that. But I think what is really interesting about your point is the more you can tap into people's natural level of enthusiasm, of drive, the language they use, how they demonstrate energy. You know, I think that's a really interesting point when you consider that actually what we tend to do in interviews is talk non-stop very much about their practical experience in a role that maybe doesn't fulfill them or maybe they're not as engaged in as we'd like. So I think the non-work angle is a really interesting and insightful angle.
And I think you can come back at the work angle as well, because
Yep.
I think you can say lots of affirming things about the work experience that's been presented in the room, but almost as a throwaway question to say, well, you know, you've talked about lots of projects today, but what did you get really excited about? What kind of thing would you love to do again? I really think there's a kind of I think really good candidates, what they do is a kind of bottling energy process where they present well on paper, they present well in their LinkedIn profile, and in the interview, they're actually bringing energy into the room. And I do actually, I don't know if you agree with this, Graham, but I do actually think this is a really strong indicator that you are likely to get that in terms of a workplace performance.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think to that point, even the best interviewees will often present things in a very methodical, professional manner, and I don't think it feels natural to a lot of people to go into an interview and necessarily talk about what it felt like, or almost show enthusiasm. And I know that might sound counterintuitive, but I think just by asking people what something felt like, you know, I think that almost gives them the green light that they can show that extra bit of spark. They can have a smile on their face and they can talk about how much they enjoyed it, how much it energized them, how much they loved to see those colleagues succeed. So I think even that slight switch in the interviewer's language, I think almost will allow the interviewer's language will allow the interviewee to come to life.
So I think we're agreed that we're recommending that. And as we're presenting and as we've been designing this webinar, it struck me how much we have moved on from the basics of competency-based interviewing, which at its worst, I think brought out some fairly mechanical and dull interview performances, where people trotted out the right words and described things using the right language. But there were often stories that had very little energy, very little connection to the candidate's real motivation. So I would, really strongly recommend. Yes, we all know that relationship building with a candidate is important, but see if you can find out what energizes them. And Graham suggested sometimes that means talking to them about their life outside work as well. But don't be happy with that. Go back into their work history as well and find out what gives them a buzz and where they find themselves really engaged in the work that they do. After all, organizations are spending huge amounts of money at the moment looking at engagement, looking at how people are connected and whether talent is going to stay inside the organization. So it makes perfect sense to try and get that right in the interview stage as well. So kind of trying to summarize some of the things we've been talking about today. We've been talking about pinning down evidence. We've been talking about the fact that many candidates, either through instinct or through insecurity, or simply to do with the way that they believe they should prepare for an interview, they do tend to make either empty claims or misleading claims or cliched claims that really don't move you very far forward as an interviewer. Evidence matters, but it's our job as interviewers to make sure that candidates have really good opportunities to unlock that evidence. Some people are highly reflective. They've thought a great deal about the way they work and how they would do things differently in the future. They've thought about what they need to do in terms of their personal development. Many people don't think about that at all outside the process of looking for a job. They get on with the job and they perform well, but they're not in the business, if you like, of self-monitoring because they don't need to. And whether you're preparing candidates for interview or you've got somebody in the room with you, do encourage people to tell you stories, because we remember stories a lot longer than we remember information, and we remember energized stories even longer. So on the right hand side, some of the things I think we're looking for that will assist in pinning down evidence and predicting workplace performance. We're looking for the top level of ability. So a good reminder when you're thinking about your job description, yes, it will be a long catalogue of skills and qualities and competencies, but think about what you really need. What are the critical factors? What are the must-have characteristics of a top performer? When you're interviewing, look for performance under pressure. So ask questions which don't just allow candidates to showcase their skills, but to tell you how they performed when they were up against it in terms of deadlines or pressure or an environment where there was conflict or tension, or working with difficult people. And that takes us neatly to working style, because one of the things that, again, is going to be a fairly good indicator of whether somebody is going to deliver in the workplace and whether they're going to get on with their colleagues and whether they're going to be with you in 5 years' time as a committed performer is their working style. And the evidence is there. You just need to find really good questions which open up people's story and to find out where they've operated like this in the past. So I'm going to come back to Graham for his reflections in a moment, but here's a challenge for you if you're tuned into this webinar today. A couple of things I'd like you to think about as challenges. To think about all of the techniques that we've discussed together today, and put one into practice as soon as possible, because we all know about learning events that if we don't, the danger is we forget stuff. And there are two things that would help you remember. One is to go away and talk about a colleague this morning about something you've heard or learned about on this webinar, even if you disagreed with it. And secondly, to try something out. So put something into practice in the very next job interview that you're conducting. And think about long-term development as well. How would you like to develop as an interviewer? How would you like to broaden your expertise? How do you like to get better at identifying candidates who really are going to perform well? Well, happy to open up to questions. I think, Graham, I'd love to hear about where we've got to in terms of your thinking this morning.
Yeah, so I think just before I do, John, so I think we've got two questions. There's a practical one and maybe a more emotive one, but probably as a final offer, just while we've got a couple of minutes left, if anyone else wants to add a question to the box on the right, feel free. But the first one on the practical side of things, John, I think you've referenced job descriptions probably 4 or 5 times. It's hard to talk about, great interviewing probably without mentioning them, as much as they can be a bit of a dry document. But do you think organisations are making the process of kind of identifying this great talent harder in terms of how they manage and how they utilize job descriptions?
I think there sometimes are, because it worries me a little bit when job descriptions are effectively the result of a committee process, and a committee process that has the result of putting in almost every piece of information you can think of. I've worked with senior candidates who've been presented with up to 30 competencies that they have to address, and that's never going to be covered in any detail in an interview process. So it's a kind of a challenge, I think, with job descriptions. Is yes, they need to be accurate and up to date, but also they need to be focused, I think. and they need to say, well, what are you really looking for? What are the must-have characteristics, and what things can you live with? I mean, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we often, you come up against a generic job description because an organisation might have 4 or 5 of that type of role. But I think actually what's interesting is when you get talked to a hiring manager or a company director is actually when you're asking them, what does good look like in the next 6 months, or what are you really looking for somebody to come in and progress and move on? They have a very, very clear view. I mean, ironically, often dependent on the rest of the team that they've already got on what those things are, but the job description is a very generic and often dated document, which ironically then you're kind of giving to the candidate and expecting stroke hoping they're going to be able to come and bring themselves to life effectively for the bit that you're looking for. So I think that's a fair point, John. The second question we've got, and I think it's a really interesting one, was one around the stories, which I think is a really good point that has landed well today. Have you got any advice, John, on kind of how to get somebody talking about a story? Because I suppose certain candidates will naturally come and tell you a story. Those that aren't natural storytellers, do you think there's anything that you can do to bring that out in them?
Yeah, there are some techniques you can use. I mean, one of them is just to say, just tell me the story of this. To tell me, talk to me as if we were in the pub. Another way of doing it, particularly when you're looking at people's skills, is to just reframe a question. So, because, for example, people often talk about personal characteristics rather than their skills. So, even saying something like, if somebody was following you around with a video camera, what would they have seen you do? But warmly encouraging people to tell you a story. I mean, you could even unpack the structure for them. Just say, well, tell me a little bit about what was the challenge you faced, what did you actually do, and what was the outcome? Tell me the story that way. I think that's perfectly legitimate and of great help to people who are not natural storytellers.
And then sprinkling the other bits in that you've referenced around, how did that make you feel? What was the impact on your colleagues? And I think, just again, helping them bring that to life. I think that's fair, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely.
Great. I think, in reflection for me, John, I think we've probably got some very experienced skills interviewers that have dialed in today. So I think, in many a sense, I think what it certainly brought home to me, and I've done many interviews as part of my job, but I think it's a great reminder of the fact that whilst the interviewer is certainly probably the more comfortable individual more often than not in the room, I think not taking our eye off the ball with regards to our responsibility as an interviewer to really help make sure that an organisation is hiring the right talent, and often that talent might not be the person who is the best interviewer, and therefore some of the techniques and some of the points that you've raised, I think, are a really poignant refresher to keep us sharp with allowing every candidate to amplify what they've got to offer an organisation, and therefore hopefully make more often than not the best possible hiring decision that we can.
Well, I'd agree with that. And there's an interesting question that's just come up on screen about candidates being vague about examples and how we push them. Is it okay if we just deal with that final question?
Of course. Yeah.
My take on that is you never really push candidates into a place where they feel uncomfortable, because they're not going to disclose. People who are uncomfortable do not disclose. But I think we can gently challenge people by saying, tell me a little bit more about that, or tell me about a specific situation. Or let's even going back into their CV, saying, well, I noticed you were in this particular role. How did you use that skill in that role? So there are gentle ways, but it's setting an agenda, I think, that's really important. So, but my overall take on what we've been talking about today is that learning to probe candidate skills is actually one of the really interesting things about being an interviewer, and of course, I really do believe it leads to a better match of candidate to job.
Great. Well, thank you, John. I think that probably leads me just to to try and wrap up with a couple of points. So firstly, and really importantly, generally, Jon, thanks for the insight, the input, and the time. I think it's been a really interesting session, and I think there's some really good takeaways that you've mentioned there for people to really go and try and implement, which is always good at the end of a webinar. I think thanks for everybody who's taken the time to dial in. Hopefully, there's at least one thing in there that might be a great refresher or a point that you'd not thought of before. And don't forget that you can download the presentation material, as Jon referenced earlier on, and also look out for future events and webinars going forward. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.